with the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, which is discovering the sort of fundamental atomic particles. I still think it's really odd that you have to build this gigantic, huge thing that uses huge amounts of power in order to discover this tiny little thing that we can't see. But they discovered the Higgs boson not too long ago, which is a huge discovery in physics. So big data is being accumulated. Many times we've been hearing IPv4 and IPv6. Here's what I want to have my little rant about this transition. IPv4 has been around since 1973. IPv6 was invented in 1996 in order to allow a bigger address space for the internet. We're going to have to run both of these protocols together at the same time for quite a long period. The two can't talk directly to each other, so you have to run it in parallel. Sometimes you'll be using IPv6, sometimes you'll be using IPv4. You shouldn't have to care. The only thing that you usually see in the internet is domain names anyway, and those are bound to IP addresses, and you never see that. When you say to Google, please find me all the Thai restaurants in Mauritius, you never see any of the IP addresses. All you see is a website identifier, which is like the domain name. And those things are all you should ever worry about. The internet service providers are the ones that are supposed to pay attention to implementing IPv4 and IPv6. Now, based on my discussions this morning with some of my colleagues in the workshop, discussing IPv6 in particular, I've come away with a particular conclusion, and this one is: don't ask for IPv6, demand it, insist on it. Tell people you won't take internet service without it, because we need the additional address space in order to grow. Now, I have two other things that I want to mention before we have a chance to do some Q&A. One of them is to reinforce the notion that the internet brings an opportunity to generate businesses not only domestically or on the continent, but to bring business from outside. And this is very important to keep in mind. If you want to generate GDP growth, you don't want to be confined to the economy in the country or confined to the economy in the continent. You want to reach out to all economies that might be possible customers of your businesses, your services, and your products. So we want to use internet as a way of reaching out as well as reaching in. And this is a big opportunity here. When we see small and medium-sized businesses forming, we know that in most parts of the world, that's where a lot of the growth of jobs comes from. Small businesses that get started, they begin to grow, they need more talent. And since there are a lot of them, they represent a substantial amount of the workforce. So we want to help small and medium-sized businesses succeed. Now, there are lots of ingredients to do that. They have to have venture capital, they have to have a regulatory regime that makes it easy to create a business, but they also need the ability to export their products and services, and the internet can help with that. The internet can help make them visible to the rest of the world, and this, I think, is as important as anything I can think of, particularly in Mauritius, where tourism is a very important part of the economy, and we want people to know about what's available here. The internet is one way to help us do that. I'd like to finish by just mentioning one other thing that we can anticipate coming in the future. At Google, we have one part of our company called Google X, and it's sort of the secret laboratory where interesting things happen. Two of the most interesting things that have happened are cars that drive themselves, self-driving cars, and the other one is called Google Glass, which looks like a pair of glasses, except there's no glasses in it. There's a little television set that's up here right hand side. So let me talk about the cars for a moment. This was a project, a challenge that was given to the universities in the United States from the American Defense Department. They said, can you build a vehicle that can drive itself? And they said, we will supply you with a 127-mile path for the cars to drive on. It was not as easy as out in the middle of the desert, and there were hills and valleys and first year that they tried this, most of the cars fell off the side of the road after about 7 miles. So the next year, 13 cars made the whole 127-mile circuit, and Stanford University won with what they call the Stanford Steamer. So the Stanford vehicle won the first big complete circuit. So the next year, the Defense Department said, why don't we see if you can make the cars drive in an urban environment where there are city streets and cross sections and traffic signals and things like that. They didn't find anyone going to volunteer to be a pedestrian from downtown. But they did get a lot of contenders for the cars driving in the city, and then Carnegie Mellon University won. So, of course, Google hired the Stanford team and the Carnegie Mellon team. They're now part of Google X. We have probably 2,000 cars that have driven 500,000 miles from the city of San Francisco on their own with no accidents. There was one accident, and it was when a human was driving the car, and not the car was driving the car, and somebody ran into him in the back. So it turns out that this is quite a challenge to get an automobile to understand its environment. So there's a lot of equipment involved and a lot of software involved. There's a laser rangefinder. There are video cameras. There is a GPS receiver for location. And then there's communications, data communications. There's a great deal of data is available to the car while it's navigating. So it's not totally autonomous. It's actually able to get information from Google. What that means is that the cars actually learn from each other. Unlike human drivers who don't seem to learn from each other at all, the cars learn what the other cars have discovered. And the result of this is they get better and better over time in their driving. There is a challenge, though. It's one thing to get a car out on a city street. It's something else to get the car to pick you up from your front door and navigate to where you work and maybe park in an underground garage. That's harder, so we're still working on it. Let me talk about Google Glass for a minute, and then we can go to some Q&A. Google Glass is a very, very interesting and ambitious idea. It basically is not too different than, here we go. It's not really functionally different than gluing a little mobile to your forehead, but it's a lot more comfortable. It is just a set of glasses. It looks like a pair of glasses. It has a computer just like this does. It has a camera. It has a microphone, same here. It has, for audio, it actually uses bone conduction. So the back of the glasses touch up against the skull, and it vibrates like any speaker would, but the sound is going through the bones of your head to your ear. The good thing about that is that you don't plug up your ears, so you can hear everything else, ambient sound, at the same time you're listening to what the Google Glass has to say. Why is this such a big deal? It's really not more functional than a mobile, it's just more comfortable to wear. But here's what's important. This piece of software, which has access to our cloud computing, just like the cars do, is able to see what you see, and is able to hear what you hear. And what that means is the computer has been brought into the sensory environment that you and I live in, which means it now has context in which to help us figure out what's going on. So, for example, wearing Google Glass, I could point to this bottle of water which says vital on it, and I could ask, where does that come from? So the camera is seeing my hand pointing at the bottle. The computer figures out it's a gesture that it should pay attention to. It hears my voice saying, where does that come from? And it figures out that means what I'm pointing to. And then it does a Google search to find out why. Here's a more elaborate example. Let's imagine we have a blind German speaker and a deaf American Sign Language speaker. And they're each wearing a Google Glass. So let's see what happens. The German speaker says something in German. The deaf guy can't hear that. But the Google Glass does hear it, transcribes the German into text, translates the German into English and presents the English in the display of the Google Glass. So the deaf guy can see what the German guy said. Now, the deaf guy responds with, I don't know, signs, so I'm just making this up, but the deaf guy signs. And of course, the blind guy can't see the signs, but the Google Glass camera can see them. Translates sign language into English text, translates the text, English text, into German, and then speaks the German so that the blind guy hears that moment he's got to speak. Now, we actually can do almost all of that today. We can't quite do the sign language thing, but we're not terribly far away from that. The thing I want to impress upon you is that this experiment is a way of bringing computing power into our environment, and it's an opportunity to see what powerful things we can do when computers are our colleagues and not just our computers. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Vic, for your brilliant presentation. And if you have any questions, right, from the press and from the attendees,
okay,
please.
We do have microphones too, is that right? So you don't have to shout.
So it has been very long. We haven't listened to no question. Yes,
I'm going to take advantage of the fact that, let me explain to you, I'm hearing impaired, and so I'm sorry I'm messing with the camera what have you. This is so I can flip read you if I have to. Yeah, so I promise I won't buy your spin.
Professor Cerf, first of all, it's a great honor to have you in Mauritius. So my question is, given all that you've been exposing to us about how the future is going to look like for the internet, my question is, what would the day of a citizen maybe in 2050 look like, given all the progress of the internet?
So I wish that I had a clear vision to this. Every once in a while, when I think about that same question, I think I wish I was only 8 years old now, so I could actually live to the point where I could see it. Let me try to answer your question in an indirect way. This is 2013. Let's imagine for just a moment that we were all transported back to 1963, and we have friends from that time period, and they don't know that we come from the future. So let's ask ourselves, what happens to it? So the first thing I think that will happen is at the end of the first week, every one of us will have rubbed our noses, and the reason is that we will walk into doors that we thought were going to open by themselves for us. And so we'll walk into the door, and our friends will say, why did you do that? And we'll say, well, where I come from, the doors open themselves. And they'll say, well, you have to turn up here. Now imagine that you go into the lavatory and you put your hands underneath the faucet. And your friend says, what are you doing? You say, well, I'm waiting for the water to come out. He says, well, you have to turn this handle. He says, oh, well, where I come from, the faucets run themselves. And then we won't even talk about the part where they say, why didn't you flush the toilet? This is trying to imagine what our things that we normally assume are a part of our environment would not be there 50 years ago. So now the problem would be, what happens if someone from 2063, pushing people further, comes back to 2013? The problem is, what will happen to them? What assumptions will they make that we would be a little shocked at? Well, some of them, I don't know, but some of them might be the ability to communicate with any device that happens to be nearby. You walk into a room, you expect the room to know that you're there. You expect the room to be able to answer questions. People are there for to do things for you. It's kind of like Star Trek. You know how they talk to the computer? Yes, I'm here. And turn the lights on, play some music, turn on this appliance, turn off that appliance. I'm feeling cold. Now, I don't know about the transporter thing. You probably won't have by 2063. And I would be nervous about that. What if there's a world in which software and computers will be very aware of you and your needs. You will either express them very directly in the same way we talk to each other, or the system will know who you are and will know enough about your interests or preferences that the room will be adapted to your needs. So we see little tiny bits of that even today. When you have motion sensors, for example, I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I sit down in my office and I'm reading. I'm not moving, right? And so the little motion sensor decides that I'm not there anymore and turns the lights out. And you have to wave your hands like this to get the lights to come back on. I'm still here, I'm still here. It should know that they should notice that there's some warm spot that's at 98 degrees and and it's meeting, right? So I think that there will be an assumption that your preferences will be known or will be easily expressed, or you can negotiate them simply by talking about it. And that would be typical of the day of 2050. The house will adapt itself to you. Cars will certainly drive themselves. You'll be able to get in and say, take me to that. And you might even say, and go buy the M4. And it might come back and say, no, I think that's a bad idea because there's an accident on the M4 and I'm taking you over here and I'll make this alternate route. So we will find ourselves in a much more interactive world where our world is able to interact with us, same way we talk to each other. So that's my best guess. But you may live to 2050, in which case you'll know whether I got that right or not.
I wish so. Thank you, Professor. By the way, I'm Planet Kathleen, one of the organizers as well of the conference. Nice to have you.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other questions? Yeah, these two guys. All right, they set this up.
Yes, Professor, I wanted to know, I've read about your research in interplanetary internet. So I would like you to give us a bit more information about it. What is the status of the research? Why it's important?
Why would anybody do that?
Yeah.
So, thank you. What is referred to here is what I'm calling the interplanetary internet. When I first started talking about the idea in 1997, and people thought I had lost my mind, and the real honest truth is that that was the year that a robot landed on Mars. It was called Pathfinder. And I don't know if you remember the way in which it was delivered onto the planet. It was a big balloon, or actually a collection of balloons, and it came down bouncing like this until it finally stopped, and the balloon opened up, and this little thing rolled out. I remember thinking, if someone had come into my office and said, we're going to take this $6 million device and we're going to deliver it in a bouncing balloon on Mars, I would have thrown them out of my office. You can't do that. So we were very impressed by not only the delivery method, but the information that came back from this rover. And we got to thinking that the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, what kinds of missions were now planned for 2010, 79, 10, and so on. What kind of communication system could we imagine that would be more beneficial than just point-to-point radio links? Because up until that time, all the communication to support the exploration of the solar system had been single radio links. So if you landed something on a planet, you had to transmit data directly from the planet all the way back to Earth, to the Deep Space Network, these three big 70-meter dishes. One's in Goldstone, California, one is in Canberra, Australia, and one is in Madrid, Spain. And as the Earth rotates, these antennas are looking out into the solar system. So these point-to-point radio links were all we had. And we were thinking in 1997, well, wait, we have this thing, this internet thing, and it lets everything talk to everything else. Maybe that would be useful if we could do that among the planets. So we started designing an interplanetary extension of the net. And we thought that we could use TCP/IP for this, because we thought, well, it worked on Earth, so it probably will work on Mars. And then we got to doing the calculations. We said, okay, let's see. Earth and Mars are in different orbits. When they're closest together, it's 35 million miles. And at light takes 3.5 minutes for a signal to propagate for 35 million miles of course, 3.5 minutes to come back. And when we're farthest apart in our orbits, we're 235 million miles away from each other. It takes 20 minutes for a signal going at the speed of light to get to the other side. And look, it takes light only 8 minutes to get from the sun to Earth. So, I mean, this is really far away. Now, I want you to imagine that you're running TCP/IP, and you have a 40-minute round trip time. So, you know how flow control works in TCP. It basically says, I run out of room, and you hope the other guy hears you in a few hundred milliseconds and stops sending. But in this case, you say, I run out of room, 20 minutes later they hear that. Meanwhile, they're pumping data at you for 20 minutes and it's falling all down. Flow control doesn't work. There's another problem. It's called planetary rotation. The planets are rotating and we don't know how to stop that. So the problem is that there's a spacecraft on the surface. You can't talk to it after when the planet is rotating until it comes back around again. So this is a disrupted and variably delayed system. So we said, okay, let's start over again. We designed a new set of protocols that we call the bundle protocol, and it's based on delay and disruption tolerant networking methods, which means it has to overcome variable delay and it has to prepare to deal with arbitrarily long disruption. We have now gone through 4 iterations of design. It is now operational. We have devices here on the surface of Earth that do these protocols. They talk to orbiters that are in relay around Mars. Those orbiters relay information down to the surface to the rovers and Mars Science Laboratory. Protocols are running on board the International Space Station. So we also have a spacecraft called Epoxy, which is in orbit around the Sun. And it has visited 2 comets in the last 10 years. We used it as a test facility to try out the interplanetary protocols between that orbiter and Earth. So we now have a nascent interplanetary network in operation. The protocols are being standardized by the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems, which is a UN organization of all of the spacefaring nations in the world. What we're hoping is that once they've standardized these protocols and used them for their scientific spacecraft, that when the science mission has completed, the spacecraft will be repurposed as a relay in an interplanetary backbone. So you can see how over decades you could literally grow an interplanetary system over time. There's more to this story. I will be speaking about this tomorrow in my remarks. So I'm going to keep the next part for tomorrow. But that's where we are. Over the last 15 years, real progress has been made on building and operating this planetary system. This is just what engineering is about. Engineering is just transforming science fiction into reality. That's what engineering is all about.
Any further questions?
Talking about IPv6, what do you think of original schedule? What are the responsibilities?
Okay, so actually the person who should be answering this question is Andrew Alston at Latif, who's in the back there, running the IPv6 forum. Andrew Alston gave the most wonderful presentation in our workshop this morning. He's right down to the nuts and bolts of everything. His answer is, 1, do not build another network that can't do both IPv4 and IPv6. Do not accept a piece of hardware or software that doesn't do IPv4 and IPv6. Run dual stack. Do not accept any substitute. The second thing we can do is actually start building networks that run both V4 and V6. Andrew's described several networks. He mentioned one company I hadn't heard of called Liquid Telecom, which is running IPv4 and IPv6 as a standard product. It's not special, it's not something you have to pay separately for. I hear a lot of ISPs saying, well, why should we bother with IPv6, or we need to charge somebody more for that to give us motivation to implement it. I find this to be very dense. I mean, I just do not understand. This is sort of like someone saying, I'm a mobile telephone company, and I sell these mobile phones. And I'm about to run out of telephone numbers, but that's okay, I'll sell you the phone anyway. No phone number is a really clever little piece of equipment that you can't make a phone call with. Why would you design and build a system that doesn't have expandable address space? And the honest fact is the IPv4 allowed 4.3 billion terminations. Bob Kahn and I picked that number in 1973. And at the time, we didn't even know if the internet was going to work. So we tried to figure out how many terminations we should have in this experiment. We had just finished building the ArcNet, the national scale network, and it wasn't cheap. It wasn't terribly expensive, but it wasn't cheap. So we thought, well, how many networks will there be per country? And we thought, well, maybe there'll be two, national scale networks. And then we said, how many countries are there? And we didn't know the answer, and there wasn't any Google to ask. so we guessed, and we said, well, how about 128? Because that's a power of 2. That's the only thing the programmers thinking. So that was 256, which means 8 bits of network address. Then we said, how many computers will there be in each network? We didn't know the answer to that either. And at the time, most computers were great big time-sharing machines that served, 1,000 to 10,000 people. But we said, let's be generous. How about 16 million machines per network, which means another 24 bits. So that's 32 bits of address space. That's where the number was not any more thinking than that. The community got very scared in the early 1990s that we were going to exhaust the IPv4 address space. So we went through a rapid design for IPv6 with 128 bits of address space. And then we went into a regime where we were really managing the allocation of IPv4 carefully. Well, 128 bits of address space is 3.4 times 10 to the 38. That's a number only the Congress or the Parliament can appreciate when it's talking about finance. That's enough address space to last until after I'm dead, and it's somebody else's problem. So I am a big fan right now of insisting that we start building dual stack systems. This will help us prepare, by the way, for the LTE mobiles, which do IPv6 on an end-to-end basis. There are so many benefits associated with running end-to-end. Security is better, crypto is better. There's no comparison. I want to get back to the same architecture that we had before people introduced network address translation, which was fine for client servers, but it was not very good for server to server or peer-to-peer. And so we regained the world that we had 30 years ago by implementing IPv6. Sounds like a sermon, doesn't it? I'm the chief internet evangelist at Google, so I do sermons all the time. Okay, if there are, we have to be thoughtful about telling our...
Thank you very much, because we have to move to lunch and we have another.
That's right. Okay, well, I'll let you finish off the meeting.
So I'd like to thank the panelists, right, for the press conference, and I'd also like to thank the press people, the MC, as well as all the attendees, right, and also thank you for your questions.